Welcome to Justice Beyond the Bench, a podcast by the International Association of Women Judges. I'm Jane Charles Voltaire.
And I'm Amy Lewis. In this series, we spotlight women across the global justice sector who are leading efforts to advance gender equality, strengthen judicial systems, and champion inclusive leadership.
From courtrooms to communities, we'll hear powerful stories and unpack the strategies shaping women's leadership in law and the judiciary. It's time to go beyond the bench.
Today, we're joined by María Noel Leoni, an international human rights lawyer and the Deputy Executive Director of CEJIL, the Center for Justice and International Law. She also serves as the director of the GQUAL Campaign, a global initiative working to tackle the persistent gender imbalance in international tribunals and monitoring bodies. GQUAL champions parity and transparency in how judges and experts are appointed to these influential roles.
GQUAL is a valued partner of the Women in Leadership in Law initiative. We've had the pleasure of collaborating with Maria and her team on several impactful events, including webinars and a law student networking session titled Empowering Women in International Law. We're thrilled to welcome Maria today to this episode, Closing the Gap, Strategies to Increase Women's Representation in Decision-Making Bodies. In this conversation, we'll explore the strategies, challenges, and opportunities in ensuring women have a seat and a voice at the highest levels of international and regional decision-making bodies. Welcome, Maria.
Welcome, Maria.
Hi, Jane. Hi, Amy. So grateful and excited to be here.
We're very excited to have you. Thank you again for joining us.
Of course.
Maybe we can just start off by you telling us a little bit more about your journey into the legal field and what really drives your passion for advancing equity in decision-making bodies.
So great question that makes me feel old. um, so I went to law school in Uruguay, which is my home country, and I was mostly trained to be a corporate lawyer. Like in back at law school, human rights, international law were not big subjects. So it was not subjects that gave me the idea that one could actually build a career on those. So I mostly went through law school thinking that the end game and the goal was to work at a law firm and put on a suit and go to court, maybe, which are all fantastic things. And so that's mostly what I did. So I started working mid law school at quite a large corporate firm for Uruguay standards, and then continue working there for a couple of years after graduating, doing corporate law, doing tax law, and it was a very formative experience in many ways, which are for which I'm very grateful until today. But mostly the fact that it really taught me early on that was definitely not what I wanted to do, and how I wanted to dedicate my my law skills to, and it was not an easy time because it was quite an existential crisis in a way, because I'm very focused and hardworking, and always studied very hard, and it was difficult to try to be good at something that I was not enjoyed doing, but did not know what else I could do. And it was quite a challenging time, and I think all of these coexisted in a way with the fact that I've always been very passionate about social justice, without even having the names for it, without even knowing that I was talking about human rights and international law. But I always felt very strongly about injustice and inequality, and have been doing things about that. And so I think, that was a moment where these things merged a little for me because the frustration led me to study, and through studying, I discovered feminism and gender studies and human rights. And I discovered that there was a world out there where, lawyers were human rights defenders and were not necessarily wearing suits, and they were working in civil society organizations, and they were bringing cases about injustices to international courts. And it was sort of a calling in many ways, in that I knew that I had to be part of that. And so I think I was around 25, and I quitted my job and just decided to leave Uruguay. And I moved first to Argentina to start my first master's degree on human rights. And I met a lot of people who were doing amazing work, and they inspired me, and they encouraged me to apply to a master's degree in the US, and that I could get a scholarship. And so I did that. And I'm currently based here in Washington, D.C. I came to study here at American University. I did my master's degree on gender studies and human rights, and my life really changed. And I had amazing professors who were not only great academics, but were also practitioners, were doing the work at the UN, at the US, with civil society. And I wanted to do what they were doing. And I started applying to a lot of internships. I then got my first jobs. My first job was working my first human rights job was working at the UN for the Special Rapporteurship Against Torture. The Special Rapporteur at the time was one of my law professors. And I, since then, I feel very privileged about the work that I do, and privileged that, I rarely call my work work, because I love doing what I do.
That's so fascinating, Maria. I think that parallels a lot of people's initial journey thinking about what we think a lawyer
Yeah,
looks like, and how maybe we come into our own in feminism, and how we meet people that are already kind of doing this work, and how we can just kind of move beyond that, and really find a way to kind of cultivate our own space in that field.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that, like, that changes everything, being able to see other people doing different kind of work, and so that you can get inspired, because sometimes we start our professional career so young, right? And so that kind of mentorship and inspiration, I think it's essential, to find one's own path.
Yeah. And so, now connecting it to where you are today, with CEJIL, how did that all come about? And can you, for those that are a little bit unfamiliar with CEJIL and GQUAL campaign, just explain a little bit more
Yeah.
about those missions and the work that's going on at these amazing campaign and institution?
Yeah, of course. And CEJIL, the Center for Justice and International Law, is a human rights organization. It has more than 35 years old. It does amazing work throughout the Americas, defending and protecting human rights, mainly by using international law and international protection mechanisms as a tool for social change, combined with strategic litigation, with strategic communications and advocacy. It's the organization that has, the most, the largest docket of cases before the Inter-American Commission and Court. And so it has helped build the Inter-American human rights system, and the Inter-American human rights jurisprudence. And it really relates with what I was telling before. My CEJIL is one of the first organizations that I heard about when I was starting my journey, mainly because I was studying the cases. I was reading about the cases and the decisions coming out of the Inter-American Court, and all of the time, the decision said the litigators are CEJIL, and I was like, oh my God! I mean, I would love to be part of this organization. So I actually applied for an internship early on when I was living in Argentina, and I was not accepted, which was very frustrating. And then what happened to me is that I met Viviana Kristisevic, who's executive director of CEJIL and has been leading and shaping this institution since it started. And she was one of my law professors during my master's degree. And I was and continue to be so inspired by her work, and so I wanted to be an intern. I started by being an intern there. And then I became a lawyer, and then I went on to direct the program that is run from the Argentina, from the office that the organization has in Argentina, and have been working there for 10 years already. I'm now the deputy executive director, and it's a great organization. It's a fantastic group of passionate human rights defenders, actually, who happen to be lawyers at the same time. Most of them, but I think their main title is human rights defenders, and I'm incredibly proud to be part of the institution. And GQUAL was sort of born within Sahil in many ways. So you explained a bit about GQual at the beginning. It's an initiative. It started actually 10 years ago. So it actually started when I joined Sahil. And it's a campaign to change the rules by which members of international institutions, including tribunals and bodies, but also, other key international leadership positions, like multilateral positions, are appointed. These are positions that are named by states. States nominate these people, and then they elect these people by voting. And they are critical spaces that really shape global politics and human rights and international law, and influence issues that affect us all. And women are severely underrepresented in those spaces. And so the campaign really started because we were human rights defenders litigating cases most of the time about women's rights in front of courts. Actually, the Inter-American Court at that time had, it has 7 members, all of them were men. And it was something that you could not unsee. Yeah. So I think, that's how GQual started, a little bit out of frustration and the need of doing something about it. And so 4 of us got together, one being Viviana Kristisevic and myself, a colleague who was also a lawyer at CEJIL back then, who's Alejandra Vicente, and also Professor Claudia Martin, who was also my law professor at the master's degree at American University. And we all decided to start doing something about it. And without really knowing or even thinking that it would become what it has become, and something that we would be still doing 10 years after, with a lot of hard work put into it, we launched this campaign with a call to action, just to you know simply say that this is an issue that should matter, and that women should be equally represented in these spaces, because that goes against women's rights to equality, but it also impacts and affects and takes away the potential that these institutions need to have to fulfill their mandate.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talk a lot, right, in this space about who is making the decisions and, especially when it comes to courts, but also in these international decision-making bodies, when women represent, potentially half of the population, and yet you're seeing a court of 7 men, right, that's making
Yeah.
decisions about their lives, their bodies, their economies. I think it's so important to think about. Yes, GQual, maybe started 10 years ago, but there's so much work that still remains, and these are longer term, like,
Yeah.
goals and hopefully drivers of these types of institutional change. Oh, I know that recently GQual's kind of seen some progress around women's representation in some of these regional decision-making bodies. And I was wondering if you could maybe share a little bit about some of the recent like victories or some of the milestones and what you feel like they signify for this kind of movement.
Absolutely. In the past 10 years, since we have been doing this work, never alone, but as part of a community that has been working on these issues and pushing for the changes that need to happen, there has been a lot of progress, actually. We monitor closely the participation of women and we monitor gender parity, so the participation of both men and women in around 102 international bodies and mechanisms and institutions. And the gender gap in those spaces has shrunk by 65% since we started the campaign, which is incredible. And that has, been marked by a lot of firsts. So I was mentioning the fact that the court had 7 men when we started the campaign. The court now has gender parity and has sustained gender parity in 2 election cycles. The
Oh my
Inter-American
gosh.
Commission also has achieved gender parity and has sustained gender parity. The participation of women in the UN special procedures mechanisms, which are these independent experts that really inform and monitor on the situation of human rights on many issues to the Human Rights Council. The participation of women went from, a little bit above 30% to 66% today. And that has
Wow.
included the appointment of women for the first time in around 14 mandate that had never been held by women before. And that, it was the special rapporteur on torture. For 30 years, there have been men leading that mandate. And we were very much involved in ensuring that a woman was appointed for the first time. But also the special rapporteurships on, freedom of expression, health, racial discrimination, and many other, climate change, many other special rapporteurships that are critical for women's issues and women's rights that had never been led by women. And all of these progress are not just numbers, and they have happened because, a lot of other things that are less visible have happened. There's a stronger conversation around these issues. This has permeated, and we have been able to contribute to that, to international spaces like the Organization of American States and the Human Rights Council adopting 12 resolutions that for the first time say, hey, there's a problem that women are not equally represented in UN bodies or in OAS bodies. This has led to studies and reports with recommendations and people taking on measures at the national level, at the international level to ensure that women are appointed. And so all of this, I think, is important and is progress. It's not enough, but it's progress. And I think in your question, you were referring, to the very recent important appointment that happened at the OAS, which was that for the first time since the organization exists, which is 80 years, states appointed a woman as the Deputy Secretary General. They did not do so for the Secretary General, so we will still have to wait for that. But they did so for the Deputy Secretary General, which is very important because it came with the statement that the leadership between the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General needed to convey gender parity. And so they elected a woman from a list of candidates that were all women. So it was important. It was a message, and we were very proud to have had a role in advocating for that. I do have to say that GQual does not support candidates. We do not support individual candidates. What we do is that we push for gender parity to be part of the decision making and a specific criteria when appointing these experts.
I think that's so critical to Maria, right? Like when we think about gender parity and what that means, right? And supporting a slate of candidates and maybe not a specific candidate, but really thinking about what it means to have gender parity on these bodies, right? That it's not enough to just think about it as a few women in these roles, but that the reason parity is so critical is because of the implications that this leadership has, right? And the effects that it has on women, men, girls, and boys, across, as you mentioned, climate change, torture, human rights from various angles. And I think that's the thing to remember. This isn't, about tokenism or just checking a box. This is about the real world implications of what happens when women aren't represented and what actually does happen when women are in these positions. And I think the success that GQuil's had over the last 10 years is so incredible, right? And that really in the grand scheme of things, and of course we don't want to wait, but in the grand scheme of things, 10 years up against these very entrenched institution, it's just so remarkable what you've been able to accomplish.
Thank you for that. And I think it's a shared achievement, by so many.
Now, not to get too dark, but despite these incredible gains, right, we do know that there are still significant challenges that remain. And I'm wondering if you could also kind of share with us maybe what are some of the key obstacles to achieving gender equality in these spaces, and maybe what work or what strategies GQual or CEJIL is employing to kind of mitigate these.
Of course, and yeah, absolutely. As you were saying, I mean, progress has happened, and I think it's important to acknowledge and take stock about things that have worked. Mostly because we are not where we need to be yet, and obstacles persist, and so we are all aware about the difficulties and the obstacles that affect women in accessing leadership positions at all levels of decision making at the national and at the international level. And so those those obstacles are also present in the spaces that we monitor. But some are very particular and are tied to our strategies as a campaign. One has to do with the opacity, the lack of transparency that characterizes the appointment procedures for these roles. These are appointments that are made, first, there's usually an initial national stage where governments decide to nominate candidates to these positions, like let's the International Court of Justice, or the UN Secretary General, which will be appointed next year and has never been a woman. These are roles that are first nominated by governments. Those decisions at the national level happen with, an incredible lack of transparency. There's usually not necessarily a procedure that one knows how to go. I mean, how do they select candidates? What criteria are taken into account? Do they receive recommendations, and by whom? There's rarely an opportunity to comment on who those candidates are, and to raise whatever concern one can have. And while it is quite a political decision, and it is okay for governments to take, their own political considerations into account and to safeguard certain discretion, the lack of transparency in which it happens really goes against women, and really goes against finding, I mean, or at least ensuring that the best candidates are the ones that are being nominated. So the lack of transparency happens at the national level, and it also happens at the international level. So that's a key obstacle. Transparency does not favor women, and so we do a lot of work to promote transparency by really documenting and systematizing the rules, making sure that these rules are known but also discussed. Like we have a GQUAL toolkit, for example, that aims to help to bring more transparency to these procedures. We push states and international institutions to generate more data. We generate our own data, which is really not available elsewhere, to show that states are nominating more men than women, to show that women are being, elected, not taking gender equality into account, and so on and so forth. So the lack of transparency, I think, is a key obstacle for women here. But transparency, and that's an important belief for GQual, is also not enough. It's important, but you also need gender parity or gender equality to be a criteria, to be part of the goal. The procedure needs to aim for gender parity to be the result, because otherwise, even with transparency, women face more obstacle than men, because also this happens in sort of the decision making process is really it's governed by a heavily male network of actors. Because if we think about like who are the diplomats, like the underrepresentation of women in the diplomatic world is impressive. Who are the politicians, who are the foreign ministers of the world? So it's mostly a heavily male dominated network of actors who tend to favor their male colleagues, intentionally or unintentionally. So all of those are obstacles. And then, the lack of data and measures that can help sustain this. Institutional measures are not there. So a big challenge is that a lot of the progress that I was sharing before is important, but you cannot take your eyes away, because if you look the other way, backsliding happens very easily, because institutional measures are not in place to sustain those gains. And that's a critical obstacle, and something that still is very much a need to be working on. And then, of course, gender discrimination and stereotypes, and the way that we understand merit for these positions, and the fact that, of course, not women face the same obstacles equally. A lot of these positions require people to, master English and French, and that leaves out a lot of skill. Even in organizations like the UN, that is supposed to be representative of the whole world. And, that they require you, they do not require, but they favor people who have master's degree, who have studied abroad. And, that's not always accessible for people in the global south. And so there's a lot of structural discrimination and stereotypes also that are part of the obstacles there. So some of the strategies that we do is we publish a lot of data. We use that for accountability and also for persuasion. We have build a strong network of allies to do the work with, including the International Association of Women Judges, who's a key ally of our work. We do develop mentorship tools, and then we advocate for changes in the procedures at the national and international level, and we try changing the law, because we think that there's a human right to equality in decision-making processes. Women have that right. That is an international obligation of states, and it should guide how states nominate and vote. So that's a lot of the work that we did that ended up, for example, in the adoption of General Recommendation 40 by the CEDAW committee.
I think so much of what you're saying, Maria, really touches home in terms of particularly this question of transparency, right? and how not having a clear guidelines in terms of how do you get there, right? And what are the nomination processes, but also these other points of you also as a result need to have that data and the lack of availability of data, right? Or the lack of publication, it seems, of data by on the national level, on an international level, really feeds into not having transparency because if things are more ambiguous and you don't have the facts in front of you, it's easier to allow the system to kind of continue to do as it's always done within a kind of old boys club paradigm. And, I think it's really critical, as you said, that you can't kind of put your foot off of the gas, for the reality of backsliding, and that you have to continue to really drive and to use your network, use your allies and other advocates to push forth for this right of women to have their representation at various levels of decision making. One of the things that you had talked about earlier when you were talking about your story, and I think really fits into this as well, is having examples, right? Having models, role models, representation also means that others down the pipeline, right, who might be interested in this kind of work, who might be interested in representing and sitting on these bodies, need to see other women in these positions, need to see also representation. I think excellent point on intersectionality because there are so many of these kind of hidden criteria. You have to have certain degrees and you have to have certain languages that are considered. It's really kind of key ultimately to push for representation and so that you can have a mirroring and others can see that there is a path for them. So, on a personal level, for you, who have been some of the women, individuals who have mentored, inspired you along your leadership journey?
No, I fully agree with that, and I have been very lucky to have a lot of uh, fantastic mentors who have also been friends and who have inspired me and continue to teach me. And I think that is key, absolutely, especially like for yeah, I think it applies for everyone, but especially for women because. We live in a in a world where we all face so many challenges and obstacles that being able to see women thriving and them being generous enough to share their experiences and make you part of that, I think it's everything. And one of the things that I've learned from them is to try to do exactly the same whenever I can. And I can say that just my three partners at GQUAL. Actually, I'm the youngest of them. They have been my mentors in many ways. Viviana Cristicevic and Claudia Martin, they were my law professors first. They are both from Argentina. It was great for me to coming from Uruguay, to feel so close to them culturally, and they were already doing an amazing work in a men's world, and being able to co-create GQual and still do that with them has been fantastic. And Alejandra Vicente as well. I mean, she is a fantastic lawyer, and I've learned so much from her and her work ethic too. And so I'm grateful and lucky that some of my most important mentors are the people that I still continue to work with. But I've also had male mentors who have made the difference. And I think that's important too, because, this is equality is for everyone. It's not a women's issue. I mean, and I think, I was able to work with men who understood this. They really cared about my career and wanted me to be successful while understanding that I was having it more difficult than they were having it. And I think, I'm also grateful to a lot of men as well, as mentors. And I think we need that as well in this fight for equality.
Certainly, we often talk about this goal of equality is trying to identify a pathway in which men, women, all genders can really come together and work together and be represented, and understand ways to promote human rights and representation, at all levels. So I completely agree. I've certainly had some wonderful male mentors in my life that have just been super motivating and understanding of exactly the differences, but also pushing me in critical ways. Do you think that some of these relationships have also shaped how you approach and how you think about justice and leadership and service overall? You know, you talked in the beginning about always having this passion, even maybe without the words for it, for social justice. You know, how have these relationships been influential in your understanding of these
Yeah.
concepts?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it was, like they and others too have shaped the way that I understand the law, not as a, I don't know, like a text that you read and learn and then try to apply to a specific situation, but as a thing that is alive and that is a tool for social change. These are people who have taught me that while being extremely rigorous about the legal system and how and how it works and how to use the law at the same time understand that it's power and that it's politics and that it's part of a political process where the law has a role to play in social justice and in social change. And that's so much so when you talk about international law and international human rights law. So that's why I've been mentioning the idea of human rights defenders, at least in Latin America. They're like human rights defenders all over the continent have taught me and inspired me so much because like to use the law as an advocacy tool, to use it as a tool for community mobilization, to really have social processes that address social injustices. And so I think that that's something that I've learned from a lot of these mentors that I've had. That that one should be creative about how to approach and use the law and how it can create you know conversations about power, but with a common framework that is based on human dignity. Yeah, and so those are all teachings that I apply every day, and that changed. Like since I was, from law school and coming from a law firm practice, and ending up doing what I do now and how I see myself as a lawyer right now. I think that vision is what really changed everything for me.
It seems that, a lot of what also you're saying is finding community, right? In others
Yeah.
that are also invested in that pursuit of human dignity. And that's part of it. Who else is in, yeah, our group, our community, and are driving this vision forward, even in their own ways and their own paths and lanes. One of the things that I think has been really interesting, obviously, IWJ and GQUAL are both part of the Women in Leadership and Law cohort. And so, with other organizations, it's been really interesting. I know from IWJ's perspective of being in a group, right, with other like-minded, I would say, organizations and those that are driven in terms of equality and representation and various levels in terms of human rights and what that means at international, national, regional levels. What has it meant to, you think, GQUAL, CEJIL, yourself, to be part of this Women in Leadership and Law cohort? And how do you think that's influenced, the way that GQUAL operates? It's been around for 10 years, but do you think it's made an impact in the vision or the work that you do?
Sure, and thanks for the question. I think, I mean, this cohort brings together a lot, as you were saying, a lot of organizations that believe that women's leadership and equality matters, and it's very interesting, and it has been very important for us to be part of that group because I admire the work that all of these organizations do. I deeply admire the work that the International Association of Women Judges does, and because we are sort of responding to the same challenges, but with complementary strategies, with complementary expertises and understandings of the world, because we come from working in different regions or with different group of actors that are part of the same network. And I think that's so powerful because, as you were saying before, none of us, can do it on our own. And so, finding ways in which we can share experiences and find common goals and feel that we are sharing a path and that we are not alone. I think it's incredibly powerful, and I really much like that of that group. And then, I also think that it's very powerful that I think we all have a common understanding that, women's equal participation in decision making spaces is not only a goal in and on itself, and important in and on itself, but it's also a catalyst for change. It's also part of the solution that we need to address the global challenges that we are facing today. And I think that's a powerful way of addressing this issue. And then also the fact that, women in law, something we talk a lot about women in politics, we talk a lot about women in specific areas that are incredibly important and consequential, but there's not a lot of talk and work that addresses the participation of women in the legal sector. And oftentimes when we think about the legal sector, we think very strictly about, like the legal career path. And I think the group that we are part of really does see that, the law is really an area that influences all the policy discussions that we need to have to address inequalities and structural discriminations in our societies, but also to address, global conflicts, and to address climate change and so many conflicts, of course, and so many other issues.
And Maria, it's been, as you may remember, we actually met because of being part of this cohort. That was our first opportunity to really engage, and you and the work that CEJIL and GQUAL does, and meeting Viviana as well, is just, it's incredibly inspiring. And I think the way that you talk about it is so critical. The way that we kind of share our stories and share this data, and the ways that we talk about representation really matter, and I think one thing that you really mentioned about male allyship is also so key too, right? Like, this can't just be something that only women care about. One thing that we've been thinking a lot about at the IAWJ is, like, who else cares about the things that we think are important, right? When we're working with judges or judiciaries, who else does this matter to besides just the women judges that we work with? And I think for there to really be traction and sustainability, this can't just be for women by women. It can start and it can navigate as that, but we really have to create those partnerships and those allies. And I think you spoke about that in ways that really kind of elevate that. I think as we're thinking all this amazing work that you've shared, that CEJIL and GQUAL do, I'm just wondering a little bit more, just to kind of like close out a little bit this discussion around, women on decision-making bodies in general, just thinking more about what kind of legacy, as you think about the long term for CEJIL and GQUAL, that you hope that these campaigns or that this work will leave in the fight for gender equality in law and for women's leadership.
Um, Challenging question. I
Yes.
mean,
No pressure.
yeah, I think,
No pressure.
for GQual, I hope we can close the campaign. I mean, like in the sense that some of the targets that we have, I mean, I hope, they can be achieved. I think that, it is achievable. That's what I think about the work that GQUAL is doing. It's much more difficult for the work that CEJIL is doing, but at least like the very specific target that GQUAL has in achieving gender parity in 102 international institutions, that means that 500 women in the world need to be appointed through institutional measures that ensure gender parity. And we are talking about institutions that are created on the principle of equality and to uphold the principle of equality. So I still think that that should be very much achievable. And so, I don't know about the legacy, but I do hope that we can contribute to achieving that, and that perhaps the campaign can say, oh, okay, so now we'll focus on something different, because that's that. I know it's wishful thinking, but I do think that, like it's a very small and concrete goal that it should be achievable, and I want to still believe that it could. On the CEJIL side, I honestly have to say that I think the legacy is already there. And that's not because of, I mean, that CEJIL is, it exceeds my work, my time with the organization. It has shaped in so many ways the human rights movement in Latin America. It has shaped how the inter-American system works, and a lot of the fantastic jurisprudence and decisions, because a lot of the times we know about the decision and we know what the court said, but we do not know necessarily, that was the many people and actors that helped that. So for the legacy of CEJIL, I hope that that can be recognized very, because we are living in a moment where civil society is very much under attack, and human rights defenders, like, in my region in Latin America, is one of the most dangerous region for human rights defenders all over the world. Civic spaces are shrinking and closing, and they are so dangerous for organizations. I hope that, through CEJIL, but through the work of so many other civil society actors, their work, their contributions to democracy can be recognized and valued.
Certainly, certainly. It's incredible to, as understanding the climate also, and how the work continues because of the changing politics and moment. But it would be wonderful, of course, if GQUAL could at some point not need to be in existence in terms of its current mission, because it had achieved those goals ultimately, and that you had then a dynamic in which those that are invested, in addition to CEJIL and the folks at GQUAL and other like-minded organizations, but that you have investment from kind of a network of others that really understand the necessity of gender parity and gender equality on these bodies. Maria, I guess, as you said, there are many positions to fill, and to get to that goal and to get to that point, for GQUAL to not be as kind of central in terms of the needs as it is right now. So what advice, would you want to offer women who aspire and those that aspire to serve on a regional or international decision-making body?
Well, that's, I mean, a difficult question to answer. I mean, I've never really served in an international decision, one of these positions, and then I have not gone through those processes. So, my first advice, would be what I would do, which is really to get close and have a supporting network, and talk and listen to and know women who have held those roles and gone through those procedures, because I think the personal lived experience in these procedures that are, as I was saying before, like a lot of transparency, are incredibly political, are incredibly demanding and unpredictable in so many ways, is critical. Talking to people who have had those experiences, I think it's key. But then also, because of the work that we do, I have heard the stories from many of these amazing women, but also from people who are engaged in the appointment processes. And I think, they're, understanding how the procedures work, really understanding the written rules and the unwritten rules is key. And because while at the same time one can be critical about a lot of those things, it's the game that one needs to play right now while those things don't change. And so I think, understanding what are the merits that are valued so that one can make sure to build a career that checks those things whenever possible, just being academically involved, having publications, engaging in international processes and using international law in different ways. Those kind of things help build one profile for these kind of positions and makes you more competitive. And I think that's important. And then also, I think it's understanding that these are political processes. So building a network that can allow you to have access to the kind of connections that you need to have, which is, in honesty, very important in these roles, is critical as well. Yeah, and then I think hoping that being part, like especially for women, opening spaces for other people, and I hope that can be part of recommendations as well. That if you get to where you're aiming to get, you are mindful of who's coming behind you, and that you exercise your power and your mandate in a way that will open spaces for more women and will make it more easy than you had it. I think that that's so important, and it's not always the case.
Yeah, creating a pipeline or creating a path for others, also is key, I think, in all of this that we've been saying and being able to see oneself. Okay, well, with that, we're really thankful to have you today, but we're gonna close out with a question that we like to ask our guests, all of our guests. I'm not going to make it easy, unfortunately. But in one word, what do you think will have the greatest impact on advancing women's leadership in law?
It is challenging question. I mean, it's challenging in many ways because I think, right now, while all the progress that we have, mentioned before has happened, we are also living through a very complex context in which even, diversity and women leadership and the specific measures that I think are critical. I mean, I think, this won't happen by inertia because that's proven so far. I think, like if you look at the trends, of course there has been progress has happened, but it's not just waiting for it to happen. Time will not fix the issue. It has not done so far, and it will not do that. And if it does, it assumes that we will be waiting for a very, very long time. For example, for the International Court of Justice, we have made the calculation, and at the current trend, gender parity will not be achieved until after 2050. So, like, yeah, and that's assuming nothing changes in a context where everything is changing. So I think, like what it will change, we need institutional measures because it's not an issue of a lack of competent women. I mean, sometimes we hear that, and that's definitely not the case. In fact, we have seen more women applying to these positions in the past 10 years at increasingly rates. So it's not an issue of not having competent women. So that's not an issue that needs to be fixed. It's not an issue of women not being interested in leadership positions. So that's not something that needs to be fixed. And of course, we need to fix the patriarchy, but that's incredibly challenging. And so what I think is needed are, institutional buy-in and making this connection that I was referring to before, in which we understand that equality in leadership is not a women's issue. It's not only to, it's about women's rights, but it's not only about that. It's about finding viable solutions and better ways of doing things in a world that is broken in so many ways. So I think, like those are some of the things that need to happen. And a way in which I think those things could be accelerated is by having institutional measures that really, say, okay, I mean, we need gender parity. We need gender equality as an institutional measure. We are not going to be allowing this not to continue to happen. So that's part of the focus that we have, because we strongly believe that that is what is needed, because that encourages more women to feel comfortable in applying to these positions, that makes the procedures more competitive for everyone, for women and men. So these kind of measures do not favor women and favor qualified men, which sometimes we also hear. So that's the thing I think needs to happen. At the same time, what I think we need to do at this moment is very much hold the line on all the progress that has been achieved, because we are facing a lot of threats, and we need to protect very strongly what has been achieved and not concede ground. I think that's very important.
Holding the line and institutional measures, getting that buy-in, making sure that others are invested, that's key.
Yeah, and I think, we talk a lot about transparency and accountability mechanisms, and to your point, Maria, holding these institutions accountable, right, to what their mission is, right? Equality, equal dispensation of justice, representation, upholding human rights and human dignity, and making sure that they do what they were designed and intended to do, but also understanding that these structures were built in a rigged system too, right? We we talk a lot about what keeps us up at night, and I often say fixing the patriarchy, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, as we know. But these systems were designed for a certain group and by a certain group, and now we have to hold them accountable to their actual mission. So Maria, it's just been so wonderful to talk with you today and to get these insights and to hear so much more about the work of CEJIL and GQUAL. Your insights have been so powerful, and the work that CEJIL and GQUAL do continues to inspire us and challenge us, I think all, to think more broadly about what equitable leadership in law truly looks like and what the ramifications of that truly could be.
Thank you. It has been my pleasure. Well, I also, wanna wish the most success to this podcast, because I know it's a new initiative, and I think it's a fantastic one, and I congratulate you for all the work that you're putting into it.
Thank you for tuning into Justice Beyond the Bench. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Want to learn more about our work and support our mission? Visit us at iawj.org, where you can explore our programs, join our global network, or make a donation to help advance gender equity in judiciaries around the world. See you next time.